Alright, so let's go ahead and now start chapter 4, where we're going to get into our first actual body system, which is the integumentary system, aka the skin. So what are we going to get into with this particular chapter? We're going to talk about the integumentary system and how it helps maintain homeostasis. We're going to talk about the layers of the skin and what each layer is responsible for, and then get into some of the accessory structures in the skin and what they do, and then get into how the integumentary system changes during aging, as well as go into things like common diseases, disorders, and injuries that can affect the integumentary system, and what are some of the treatments for those same things. So let's start with the layers of the skin in this video. So we're going to talk about these layers and components. We're going to talk about the functions of them, and then also talk about something that goes kind of beyond the layers of the skin, which would be the hypodermis and the fascia. And then we'll talk about keratinocytes and their life cycle, and melanocytes when it comes to determining skin pigmentation. So when we look at the layers of the skin, there's two main layers, right? And that's the epidermis and the dermis. So this is where when we're looking at the skin, we're looking at lots and lots of layers of cells and tissues that are held together by connective tissues. We're looking at epithelial and then some connective tissues. So the two main players, the two big ones in the skin, with the stratified squamous being the primary type of tissue we see in the epidermis, and then the dense irregular tissue, right, for connective tissue found in the dermis. So here's our nice little cartoon picture of the skin, and including some of the other components. We have the epidermis up here at the top, shown in this peach color, and then the dermis down below that, a little bit thicker there, that is shown in that more pink color. But we see that the epidermis and the dermis are not alone. There's a lot of other things going on there. We have hairs, right, that come and protrude out through the epidermis, but they root down into the hair root and the hair follicle, right? Going alongside these hairs, we have sebaceous glands that are kind of branching off of that. We also have little muscles, this little tiny muscle here, the erector pili muscle. So when your hair stands on end, right, like when you get goosebumps or whatnot, or your hair stands up because you sense something is off, right, that would be the erector pili muscle doing its job. We have a sweat gland here, right? In this case, we're looking at eccrine sweat gland, right? That again is rooted down in the dermis, but makes its way and opens up through the epidermis. We have some Pacinian corpuscles, some adipose tissue, some free nerve endings that are floating around in here too, that are not necessarily labeled, but they're there. And then we also have some nerve fibers, right? So like this one's a sensory nerve fiber. And then over here we have the cutaneous vascular plexus, right? Cutaneous, we think skin, right? Vascular, right? We think blood vessels. All right, but let's start from the top and move our way in. So we're going to talk about the epidermis first. This is composed of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium and is avascular. And again, this is why you can scrape the epidermis, you can cut the epidermis, and you don't bleed, right, if you get a very shallow cut, because there are no blood vessels there, and with no blood vessels means no blood. Depending on where you're looking at the epidermis, you may have 4 or 5 layers of epithelial cells. It just depends on where we're looking. If you have only 4 layers, this would be thin skin. So typically we're thinking, like, I know in lab we looked at the scalp as that example, so it's thinner, we only have the 4 layers. Or thick skin, which is the 5 layers. And this typically is going to be on, we're thinking the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Right, so those ones are going to have that little extra one there. As well as some changes to how thick some of those layers are. So here's our thin skin, which is labeled A. So A on the left there is our thin skin. And then on the right here, B, that is our thick skin. And so you can really see there's a difference in how thick that epidermis is. And it makes sense if you think about it, especially the hands and feet that are in contact with a lot of things. You think about the bottom of your feet before shoes were invented, right? Or if you're walking around barefoot, you can walk around barefoot and it doesn't necessarily feel as bad. But we're going to talk about all 5 layers, right? And we're going to go from, in this case, we're going from deep to superficial. That's how our list is going on this slide. So deep, we're talking about the deepest layer in the epidermis. That would be the layer that is basically touching the dermis. And then superficial, that means the closest to the surface, right? So the stratum basal is going to be the deepest. Right on top of that is the stratum spinosum, then the stratum granulosum sandwiched in the middle, the stratum lucidum, which this is the one that is in the thick skin, but this is the layer that is missing from the thin skin. Because remember, thin skin only has 4 layers. This is the layer that's gone in the thin skin. And then the stratum corneum, which is on the very, very outside. Now, all of these layers, right, except for the stratum basal at the very base of it, are composed of keratinocytes. Right, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. But let's take a peek. Right, let's take a peek first at a little cartoon version. So we see at the very top, stratum corneum. Right, these are cells that are dead. They are filled with keratin. These you can afford to lose. Doesn't really matter. The stratum lucidum, which if we are looking at thick skin, we would have. Stratum granulosum, you notice they have these little granulars in them, this granular look, these granules. That's why it's named that. It also means when you're looking under the microscope, especially if you're looking at thick skin, this layer stands out and can kind of help you orient yourself when it comes to figuring out which cells are part of which layers. Down below that, we have the stratum spinosum, made of those keratinocytes, and then at the very, very base, the very bottom, we have the stratum basal. And it's not just the stratum basal, we also have the melanocytes hanging out down there, right, and some Merkel cells that are hanging out down there. And we'll talk about them, especially the melanocytes, of what they do and how they contribute to things like the color of your skin. If we look at our picture, right, stratum corneum is that kind of pinkish color, then the stratum lucidum below that is more of a purple. The stratum granulosum is that deeper purple, and its picture's a little blurry, but if you look at it under a scope, you would actually see that grainy appearance. The stratum spinosum, which is that lighter purple just below that, and then the stratum basal, you'll notice, actually has a little bit of color to it in this case, right? We're seeing that it goes from a purple color to almost a maroon. Right, instead there's kind of some brown hints to that stratum basal. Right, underneath that, everything in that lighter pink, that is the dermis. That's going well beyond the epidermis at that point. So let's talk about these, and we're going to start from the bottom up, but let's go ahead and get into stratum basal. So stratum basal, again, is the deepest layer of the epidermis. It is a single layer of cells going across. And we have the 3 types. We have the basal cells, the Merkel cells, and the melanocytes. Right? So basal cells, think basal, you think baseline, you think bottom, right? These are the ones that are basically helping generate the rest of the epidermis. Right? So they're at the very bottom there. They're just going through mitosis. They're producing more keratinocytes to form all the layers that go over it. Right? So you can think of them as kind of like the germ line, right, for the epidermis in a way. There's also Merkel cells. Merkel cells are going to be receptors that basically help you perceive touch, to understand if you're touching something, what does it feel like, things like that. So the Merkel cells are kind of at the very end, and they're going to talk to your sensory nerves to communicate what things feel like. And then melanocytes. As the name implies, in melano, we think melanin. That's the pigment that is responsible for the color that we see in our hair and our skin. And so melanocytes are also hanging out at this deepest layer, producing that melanin. We'll talk about how that melanin moves through the layers as well. The cells in the stratum basal are actually kind of stuck to the dermis. They're kind of intertwined with collagen fibers, and so we call this the basement membrane too, right? These collagen fibers, where we kind of are forming this anchoring system, right, for the epidermis to hold on to. The dermal papilla, if you notice looking at the pictures, it's not a straight line all the way across. It kind of, the epidermis kind of dives down and then back up, and then the dermis kind of reaches upwards. So you have a wavy appearance where the epidermis and dermis meet. All those little extensions of the dermis that are kind of poking upward into the epidermis are called papillae, and this is to help increase the strength of these connections so that the epidermis really truly is rooted down to the dermis. Alright, so then we get to the stratum spinosum just above that, and we're seeing a larger layer here where we're looking at 8 to 10 layers of cells. We're looking at skin cells, keratinocytes. They're connected by those desmosomes, which, if you remember from before, that is one of those anchoring junctions that connects cells to cells, right? And then kind of hanging out in the stratum spinosum as well, we have Langerhans cells. Langerhans cells are these kind of special macrophages, so they're going to kind of help in terms of immune response, right? We won't get deep in that, but just keep in mind you do have kind of these, white blood cells, these Langerhans cells that are on the lookout for anything that is not supposed to be there. Right. Getting into the middle, we have the stratum granulosum, and as the name implies, they have a grainy appearance. This one's a little bit thinner, just about 3 to 5 layers of cells in this one, and this is where we're getting the production of all that keratin, right, and keratinohyaline. But I'm really worried about like the keratin here. So they're producing large amounts of keratin, and these guys are starting to kind of break down a little bit. The nucleus, the organelles are starting to disintegrate at this point. We keep moving up, we get to the stratum lucidum. This again is only in the thick skin, right? The thin skin does not have this layer, but this is where now the keratinocytes, they're starting to die and flatten out. Right, they're getting packed with alidin, which is this protein that has a bunch of lipids in it, right? It's going to give them this transparent, hence the name lucidum, this lucid, right, transparent appearance. And this is going to help with water tightness, right, providing a barrier to liquids. Again, this is only in the thick skin. And we get up to the very top, right? This is the stratum corneum. This is where we have 15 to 30 layers of cells. These cells are now dead, right? Because as we've been moving up through the layers, we've been filled with keratin, right? We're now a dead cell. This is 15 to 30 layers of dead cells that you can afford to lose. So we have this keratinization that's extreme now, or what we call cornification. And so we can shed these cells. It's not a big deal because they're already dead, but they do provide some protection for us, right? Protection against, the physical environment, the biological environment that's around us, so that we are not getting wounded very easily. If something scrapes off a layer of these cells, it doesn't matter, right? And things like bacteria and whatnot are going to have a heck of a time getting through all these cells too. It's kind of nice that we have this stratum corneum. And we're shedding these all the time. In fact, most of the dust in your house probably to some degree is containing your own cells, because you're shedding them, every single day, about every month, every 4 weeks. The entire layer has been replaced from the bottom up, right, in the stratum corneum. So you think about, that's a lot of skin cells that are kind of free floating, that are just kind of sloughing off in the environment around you. Alright, moving from the epidermis, we're going to go deep to the dermis. This is just below the epidermis, and this is where I kind of say it has the meat and potatoes of the skin, because this is where we find a lot of the cool stuff. We're going to find the blood vessels and blood, we're going to find lymph vessels, we're going to find nerves, the hair follicles, sweat glands, sebaceous glands. We're going to find all the fun, interesting things down in the dermis. And there's two main components, or two main layers to the dermis. We have the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So let's talk about each. Right. So if we get ourselves kind of familiar, right, with the dermis, we have the epidermis up here in this darker pink purple, but down below in this lighter pink, this is where the dermis is. And so we see these dermal papillae, how the dermis kind of extends up. Again, this is going to be to help keep the epidermis and dermis anchored together. And all these papillae together are called the papillary layer. That makes sense, right? We call them papillae. Makes sense that we would call that layer the papillary layer. And then down below that, where we get into our dense, irregular connective tissue, this is what we call the reticular layer. So in the papillary layer, we'd see things like loose areolar connective tissue. So if you remember from histology, areolar connective tissue kind of looks like a mess, right? Lots of different fibers running in different directions, lots of different types of cells like mast cells and fibroblasts and whatnot all hanging out in there with the elastin and the collagen fibers. The papillary layer is where we have those dermal papillae that I mentioned. And we're also going to have some of the like lymphatic capillaries, some nerve fibers, and Meissner corpuscles, which are going to help with sensation as well. And then the reticular layer, this is the dense irregular connective tissue. So we're looking at collagen, 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 collagen. Now below the dermis, we get to the hypodermis. The hypodermis is technically not considered skin, right? Because this the hypodermis primarily is made of adipose, and so fats, right? It's sometimes called the subcutaneous layer because it's below the cutaneous layers, it's below the skin, and sometimes also called the superficial fascia, right? It's the connective tissue that is closest to the surface, right, underneath the skin. We have a lot more blood vessels here. We have areolar connective tissue. We have adipose tissue, so fats. And so this is going to help with, one, fat storage, right, lipid storage, as well as insulation and cushioning. It's important to note that everybody needs some fat tissue, some adipose tissue, because you need some sort of long-term energy storage, which would be the lipids. And if you think about it too, if you that layer of fat below the skin is going to help insulate you. It's something that you tend to lose as you get older, which is why elderly people tend to feel colder a little bit easier than someone who's younger. It's not necessarily, because they're thinner or anything like that, although that can come into play as well. But because the specific areas that they're losing fat, like right below the skin, that insulation is disappearing. Right? And then cushioning. Think of adipose tissue in a way as kind of like your natural airbag. Alright, but let's now get into pigmentation, because we talked about the epidermis and we talked about melanocytes very briefly, but we didn't actually get into the detail of how those melanocytes work. And so pigmentation, like the color of your skin, is influenced by pigments, primarily melanin, which is produced by melanocytes. If you are exposed to the sun, this can basically stimulate your keratinocytes to communicate with the melanocytes and tell the melanocytes to produce more melanin through like a chemical signal. And so this is why your skin color can change to some degree with sun exposure, is because it's getting damaged, right, from the UV light. And melanin can provide at least some protection against that UV light, and so those cells are going to then tell the melanocytes, hey, like, we're getting exposed to a lot of UV light, y'all need to make more melanin to provide us some protection. So you will notice, in the summer when you go outside more, like, you tend to get maybe a little bit darker to some degree, and that's a protective feature, again, that your body's basically telling melanocytes to produce more to protect you from that sun exposure. So let's take a peek. What is going on? So if we're looking at skin pigmentation, we have someone here on the left and another person's skin tone on the right. So I'll make it easy. I'm going to start with the right on the light skin, where we notice that someone's melanocytes deep down in that stratum basal, they're producing some melanin, but not a lot, right? So they produce these little packages called melanosomes, right? And those melanosomes are going to travel up through the layers and deposit that melanin. But if you don't have very dark skin, like you're like me, right? I am very light. I don't have a lot of these melanosomes with a lot of melanin, right? So I would look like this if we looked at my skin, where I'd have some melanosomes with some melanin, but not a whole lot, right? Versus on the other side, this would be someone like a person of color, right, where their melanocytes are really working hard and they're producing a lot of melanin, putting that melanin in those melanosomes. Those melanosomes make their way up through the layers and deposit that melanin. And so this is why a person of color would appear that way, right? It's because their melanocytes are doing a good job at producing all that melanin and distributing it throughout all of the layers of the skin, right? So we notice like the melanocytes are all just down at that stratum basal, right? But they're creating these little packages that can travel up through the layers, right, to give pigment all the way through all the layers of the skin.